In Orkney, we used to have an expression, "I'll be hour with the moon," meaning that I would come and visit you when the moon is full to light my way.
Well, folks, there's another full moon in the sky and we're back here again to visit you. And, of course, the expression, coming over with the moon, meaning to go and visit folk, when the moon was full and would light your way, didn't it just mean going to folks' houses? It meant getting visitors as well. And this time, we've got a visitor. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome a very dear friend of mine, Erin Farley.
Hello.
And got your name right. There you are. And it's a real pleasure to have you here. But of course, you're no stranger to being here anyway, are you?
No, it does. It feels quite like being at home, being in Orkney, but also being in your house specifically.
Mm-hmm. A regular visitor for the Storytelling Festival. But you are now working at Angus Archives, is it?
I'm actually working at Dundee Library's local history centre. Important geographical divide there. But what I like to think of myself as working with the tradition of historic Forfarshire, because Dundee would have historically been the county town, or well, no. So Dundee would have been the main city, but Forfar was the county town. Dundee was in Angus, or Forfarshire as it was known. Obviously now with your modern council divisions, things are done slightly differently, but I think, it's all tradition doesn't respect borders.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So. I remember a guy in Sweden that I met once who was really infuriated with the Sami because they had said, we will designate you a homeland in the north of Sweden. And they said, you can stuff your boundaries up your arse because we don't respect them. We are nomadic reindeer herders. We go from Norway into Sweden to Finland into Russia. We follow the reindeer and we don't have any set place. So we don't need a homeland. We don't understand the concept. We don't respect it. So, So, yeah, and it's the same with traditions as well, respect no boundaries.
Yes.
But it's kind of, how I know you really is as a storyteller. And that was something that you got into at quite a young age, or the love of folk tales.
Definitely. And so I think as you get older, you sort of put together things that have always been present in your life and realise, I have always actually been quite into this. And I think one of the earliest kind of storytelling or memories of stories that I have was when I was wee. My mum's friend Colby gave me this cassette tape, which was children's folk tales from the Orkney Islands. And I don't think we've ever been able to track down what tape that was, who recorded it when it came out. So the tape I had was like it had been taped off of the radio. So it wasn't, it didn't have a cover sort of art or anything. It was just a recorded tape. But it had a number of stories on it, which I've since heard, yourself telling over the years. And the one which really kind of wormed its way into my brain is,
see what you did there?
The Muckle Mester Stoorworm.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a story which was kind of right from a really young age, was just in my head. I just had this really vivid kind of imaginary picture of the Stoorworm. And many of the listeners probably will be familiar with the Stoorworm, but
a lot won't.
A lot won't.
Mm-hmm.
I won't tell the full story because if you're going to do it properly, it is quite an epic story. But it's a creation legend from Orkney, which tells of the hero Acedemic. And Tom, you're kind of the expert on the Stoorworm, and I realise I'm just sitting here on your podcast talking about the Stoorworm. But Acedemic is the sort of youngest son of the family, and he's a fantastic hero for a story because he's a storyteller himself. He just likes to sort of tell tales, and he's just sort of known for sitting by the fire covered in ashes, and he's no use on the farm. So his family kind of despairs of him a bit, but when the Muckle Mester Stoorworm appears, which is this absolutely gigantic sea monster, he's so big he can encircle the world with his tail and his mouth, and is quite a fearsome creature, poisonous breath, taste for maidens. All of the red flags, really. And the king of the land doesn't know what he's going to do. Gets advice from a wise man who says, well, you could make the Stoorworm go away if you feed him your daughter, the Princess Jem de Lovely, because she is descended from the great god Odin. That would be a worthy sacrifice. And the king's not super keen on this idea, so he decides to see if he can find anybody to fight the Stoorworm first. And the sort of brave knights, the battle heroes of the age, all come and try their hand, but none of them succeed. A lot of death and a lot of running away. But Acedemic, when he comes to hear of this, he sort of says, I'll fight the Stoorworm. And his dad sort of says, you'll fight the Stoorworm when I make spoons for the horns of the moon, which is a brilliant phrase. And despite this, Acedemic sneaks off. He commandeers his dad's magically fast horse Teat-gong, speeds away down to the shore. And the sort of genius part of his plan is he sneaks into an old woman's cottage. He takes a pot and gets a peat from her fire, and he carries that with him. And he goes and says to the king's guard, who's sitting in a wee boat by the shore, that, right, I'm away to fight the Stoorworm. The guard takes one look at this sort of wee scruffy boy covered in ashes and says, no, you're not. So Acedemic sort of says, oh, well, fair enough. I'll just, make a wee fire, make some limpets for my breakfast, and says to the guard, do you want to come ashore? Warm yourself. You must be cold being out there in a boat all night. And the guard says, well, you're not getting me that easily. But then Acedemic starts digging a wee hole in the sand and, making like he's going to make a fire. And then he sort of leaps up and shouts, I've found gold! I've found gold! And of course the king's guard leaps off the boat, shoves Acedemic out the way, starts digging in the ground to get the gold. Acedemic's just away on that boat with his peat and his pot. And at this point, it's coming up for dawn, so the Stoorworm's beginning to wake up and yawn, his big yawn, which is his demand to be fed. And Acedemic rows all the way down inside the Stoorworm and, finds his way through all its gullets and its guts, and finds that he can see because there's this sort of phosphorescent glow inside the worm, and he finds his way to its liver, which is what he's looking for, and cuts a wee hole in it and puts the peat in there and blows on it to light it up, because the liver is just full of an immense amount of oil, like a gigantic fish liver. And so Acedemic then rows and rows and rows to get out of there, because as the fire spreads throughout the Stoorworm's body, it is starting to writhe in pain, and it vomits Acedemic up on this big tide of seawater. And, well, he sort of watches from the shore as the Stoorworm starts to die, and it raises its head up and crashes down onto the ocean floor, and some of its teeth fall out of its mouth, and those teeth become the Faroe Islands. And then it raises its head up and crashes down again, and another set of teeth, they become the Shetland Islands. And then it raises its head up one final time, crashes down, and another the last set of its teeth fall out of its mouth, and these become the Orkney Islands. And the Stoorworm's tongue, as it thrashes down into the earth, this causes a great gully that the seawater rushes into. This is the Baltic Sea. And you can see the forks of the Stoorworm's tongue at the end of the Baltic Sea on a map. And as the Stoorworm is dying, it wraps up round and round and round its liver. And this, of course, is so big that, it's still out there as a pretty substantial landmass. And this is Iceland. And the liver still burning away inside is where the volcanoes and the hot springs of Iceland come from. And, of course, the king is absolutely delighted when he finds out that Asipattle has saved the day and killed the Stoorworm and saved his daughter. So, the king welcomes him up to the palace, gives him a good wash, introduces him to the princess. Turns out they get on quite well, and the two of them are married and live happily ever after.
Wonderful.
So that's a very nutshell version of the Stoorworm.
Oh, it can, it's an epic story, but it's a cracking tale. And was Lawrence Tulloch, the great Shetland storyteller, a great friend of mine. It was his favourite story as well. It's the first story he ever had me tell, and he just thought, it's a great story.
It's an amazing story for so many reasons. The sort of hero's journey is a really kind of appealing part of it, but there's also the creation out of destruction that kind of is such a strong part of the story is something that really appeals to me as well. And that was the element of the Stoorworm. If we sort of fast forward a few years from me kind of hearing this when I'm 5 or 6 years old, and then starting to look into it as a student of folklore, then one of the things that really struck me about it is it's so obviously it's a way of looking at that landscape from a seafaring perspective. I think with the image of the Stoorworm, it's quite obviously, there's a Jörmungandr, the Norse world serpent, influence there.
Could you just explain a little bit about Jörmungandr? Because, we're all familiar with them here, but people out there might not necessarily know.
This is from the Norse myths. Jörmungandr is the world serpent, and like the Stoorworm, he's big enough to encircle the world with his tail in his mouth. And Thor has a kind of ongoing battle with Jörmungandr.
He's got a beef with him.
So, and there's, he goes out fishing and ends up having this epic wrestle with the world serpent. And he's somebody that, he's one of the omens of the end of the world, isn't he, as well? At Ragnarök, the serpent is one of the big signs of that coming.
It's the kind of personal side of it as well, is that there is 3 monstrous offspring of Loki. Not mentioning Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, who actually was Loki's own child. He gave birth to it himself because he took a shapeshifter. He was in the shape of a mare, trying to lure a stallion away from being able to, for a giant to be able to complete building the walls of Asgard. And so it was like cheating them of this. But with a giantess, he had 3 monstrous offsprings. There was Fenrir, the wolf, who will kill Odin at Ragnarök. There was Jörmungandr, Midgard Urm, the great serpent that wrapped around the world, who was only a small snake when he came into heaven, and Fenrir was only a pup, but they managed to bind him, and Thor threw the serpent out into the sea, which was probably a really bad idea. And the other one was Hell, poor girl. She was half human, half normal live human, and half corpse. And she, her lower half was a dead body decaying. And she presided over the realm of the dead. So, yeah, and they all appear, of course, at Ragnarök at the battle end of time. But the other thing probably mentioned about the Muckle Mester Stoorworm is that it's 3 words that mean the same thing.
Yeah, which is a really nice kind of sign of how the stories come through different, language traditions maybe. So Muckle, Scots word for big. Mester, would that be a particularly Orcadian word?
Yeah, it's an Orkney dialect where the Mester is meant bigger or superior.
Yes, and Stoor is from the Norse for big.
Oh, Norse, yeah. And Orm, of course, was a worm.
A worm. And that's the other thing that I found really important when I started looking into these stories. It's not necessarily serpents, it's not necessarily dragons, it's worms. There's something really interesting going on with the worms. There's quite a few stories, all kind of places that have had significant like Viking presence in the UK, where you get a story about a worm shaping the landscape in some way, and quite often it's like it's wrapped around a hill. So people have seen a hill which has kind of patterns on it, which might actually be like prehistoric kind of archaeology sometimes, or it might just be a hill that suggests the shape of a worm around it through sort of natural geological features. But there's often stories about this being caused by a worm wrapping its way around the hill. And that motif of the wee baby worm being cast out into the river by somebody who really ought to have known better. This shows up. There's a North of England story, the Lambton worm, where it's like the young kind of laird's son who, he throws this worm out into the river, goes off to the Crusades and comes back to find it's like terrorising the countryside and has to defeat it. And the other thing a lot of these share is the idea of fire being the thing you destroy it with. So it's not always like if the worm is a wee bit smaller than the Stoorworm, you might not be able to get right inside it yourself, but you can use like a smoking peat on the end of an arrow and kind of thrust that down its throat. And this sort of destruction of the worm with fire seems to be a really old motif.
I think I've heard that on a lance as well.
Yeah.
Burning peat on the end of a lance. There is a kind of a version of that story actually from Estonia.
Yeah.
I believe. So I've been told. It's either Estonia or Lithuania. It was one of the Baltic states, but they had something similar.
There's a really similar, I can't remember where exactly it's from, but there's a Native American story as well about a monster being destroyed by sort of fire from inside, which it's always really interesting when you get these oddly specific parallels in totally different parts of the world. But
it kind of reminds me of what you're saying about hills and all that the island of Rousey, if you look at the hill on that, it's got all these terraces on it. And it's glaciation that actually caused that. But it does look like you could fit a worm in there.
Yeah. Do you think there's not a Rousey worm just because there was the Muckle Mester Stoorworm kind of keeping everybody occupied? And,
didn't need it.
Think about,
been there, done
having
that.
a Rousey worm.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is going on with the worms is that people seem to be thinking about them in some ways like a really giant version of like an earthworm or a maggot, because they are kind of doing this transformation, and people see worms transforming a dead body back into the earth. And there are a lot of, and also in Orkney, there's a charm, the wormy lines, which is a charm against toothache. And people envisaged the toothache being caused by a little worm in your tooth. and it's a charm to get rid of the worm in your tooth. But it uses kind of verse patterns that are really similar to some really, really old sort of Indo-European serpent slaying myths. So there's something really, really interesting going on with how people think about, you know, giant worms causing creation and destruction on one end of the scale, and then small worms causing creation and destruction, turning a body back into the earth. And I love that sense that, you know, us and the earth are all made of the same material, and we go back and forth between it, and we're sort of, you know, going in between different states of being. And it's all just this endless cycle.
With the wormy lines, which I believe was just like a prayer to, was it Jesus or was it St. Peter? I
think they're both in there, actually.
It's both of them, that's right. But he's sort of like, one of them's, well, Peter's crying because he's got toothache, and he sort of like orders the worm out of him, and then this is written on a bit of paper and worn around your neck, and it's supposed to cure your toothache. There was a Orkney, difficult what to call Chory Marwick, because he was a storyteller, basically. But he was kind of like a tradition bearer in Orkney. But he had a go at many things, some more successfully than others. His place name, his language thing is kind of, you know, just we don't pay much attention to it, but it does have some interesting information in it. But in one of it, he said that he was working in Shetland, and there was an old woman was out digging in her garden, and well, in her planty crew, so her cabbage patch, you know, with a wall around it. And she was lamenting that she had the worm in her coliac, I think she called it, which is not a word that I knew, but it's in Jacobson's etymological dictionary of Shetland Norn, and it means the jawbone.
Oh, that sounds painful.
And she was complaining about this, and so being a nice guy, Chordy gave her, he had a flask of rum. So he gave her some rum, and she sort of like took that and swilled it around her tooth to kill the worm in it. And then he gave her some in a little cup to keep as well. And the next day when he was back there, she was declaring that it had worked because she was, you know, the toothache was much better. So, but yeah, worms were seen as being getting into bones and teeth and causing pain. So, I was interested, actually. There was a book of wartime reminiscences by a guy called Norman Baldwin, called Fairboon Hill, which is an area in Bursey, and that's where he was stationed during the war. And he referred to an Orkney term in it as Titko, meaning a sudden gust of wind. I'd never heard that because me folk are for the North Isles, and we have different dialects in the different islands and parishes. There's no standard Orcadian, you know. So, but I thought, it's a horse that runs as fast as the wind.
Yeah, so that makes perfect sense.
Absolutely.
So that was the story that first brought me to Orkney. The first time I came up was about when I was researching these worm stories, and it was the first St Magnus conference, which was between Orkney and Shetland. It was organised by UHI, University of the Highlands and Islands. And I thought, well, that seems like a good excuse to kind of go up and speak to folk and see who knows about this stuff. So I came up to that and just started asking people, oh, who should I talk to about stories? And, you know, the first person's like, oh, well, Tom Muir. And then second person's like, oh, Tom Muir. And then I think one of the third or fourth people I asked was Tom Rendell, who's one of your colleagues. And he says, well, definitely Tom Muir. And also I'm doing a thing with him tonight. So do you want to come along to that? because
that was at St Magnus Kirk in Bursey.
Yeah, it was St Magnus Day.
St Magnus Day, which is the 16th of April, and I was telling the story of St Magnus's life.
Yeah. So I can't remember what the context was when I first encountered you. I think I was just kind of randomly got into a car from a street corner. I remember it reasonably well, because I tend to remember things as long as it's not crucially important, in which case forget it. And the number of times I've come home without the shopping, or I've come home with random shopping that had nothing to do with what I was supposed to go for in the first place. But I picked you up on Pickacoy Road. So I don't know whether you were in the camp there or... I was staying at a hostel near there, yeah.
Right. So just sort of picked you up off the road and with a spangly bonnet on, I seem to remember, which seemed to be a feature for quite a while.
Yeah, I did have a very sparkly hat era. Kind of moved away from that now, but...
But off we went, and then that was... And then we got together and did a recording.
Yeah, because I came back to Orkney to interview you, talking about the Stoorworm and about the stories. And the first time I did it, then it didn't work, so I had to come back.
I thought it was a nice wee. Well, I shouldn't be saying this in public, but it was a nice wee skive, because it was a beautiful day, summer's day. It was nice and sunny. And I thought, why the hell, if you're going to record me talking about Stoorworm, this is going to take a while, why the hell sit in an office in the museum? So we went down to Angus Bay, which was kind of just around from where I was born, and sat on the sandy beach there and did a recording.
That was, and it was really good. And then, the feeling when you plug the thing into your computer and you look at it and it's just a flat line. Like, I've no idea what actually went wrong with that. But it meant I came back to Orkney and interviewed you again, and then sort of kept coming back to go to the storytelling festival. So yeah, I think my journey of kind of storytelling and also researching stories and folklore and sort of culture, it's kind of been happening parallel to each other. It's quite hard to actually separate them in my mind. And I think, it's quite interesting, because sometimes it feels like there should be a separation between the kind of performance of things and the knowledge and the sort of research of them. But actually, a lot of stories are how we pass on knowledge about the past and about places. And it's kind of a way of knowing the world. So...
Absolutely. But, I mean, I think that when you're telling stories, or if you're singing songs or whatever, it's really good to know what the background is.
Yeah.
Rather than just, here's some words that I know that goes in this order, Yeah. But to understand it gives a much better meaning.
I've always felt that I need to know, like, why I'm learning a story, or, why I'm telling a story for it to make sense. So I don't always learn. I'm not like learning new stories every day sort of thing, because, I feel like sometimes the stories pick me rather than I pick the stories. Like they come to me in some roundabout way. I don't mean like they come to me in a dream or that, but I'll hear somebody telling something, or I'll go to a place and find a hint of something interesting that's going on, and then look into it in a bit more detail. And that's kind of how I figured out, right, this is something that I might want to tell in the future.
Do you have any examples of that?
That is a good question. So one of the stories that I've kind of come across almost by accident is there's loads of them, actually. I'm just kind of going through my head, wondering what to talk about. But one of the other things that I've done, as I mentioned, I was kind of coming up to record you. I've done quite a lot of oral history work. And one of the sort of biggest oral history projects that I've worked on was an oral history of the Northern Lighthouse Board and the sort of keepers and their families and the boat crews and people who worked in the lighthouse service coming up to automation and during the process of automation. So it was really interesting from that perspective, you know, seeing how people felt about this way of life as it kind of changed and in some ways just finished for people actually living on lighthouses. And that was a really interesting way of working as well, sort of going around Scotland and basically just talking to all these different folk in coastal communities. And it is, you know, it's really quite a privilege when people sort of trust you with their life stories and that as well, and kind of want to share things with you. So that, you know, it always feels like a big responsibility, I think, when you're going to record somebody. And there are occasional stories that I've learned from people, sort of telling me them during these interviews. And my absolute favourite, I heard from a man called Alan Law, who lives just over the Pentland Firth in Thurso. He was from England originally, but he'd spent most of his life working on the lighthouses in Scotland. And they're a really interesting family as well. Like his wife Jennifer had been one of the only kind of women lighthouse keepers in Scotland as well. And I think they were maybe the only married couple who were both lighthouse keepers but worked on different lighthouses. And one of the stories that Alan told me, he was one of these people that you could speak to literally all day. He just had kind of a constant, you know, remembered loads of really interesting things. But one of the stories was from his time working on a lighthouse called Sanda, which is down in the southwest coast of Scotland. And the way that this lighthouse is built, it's sort of up against a cliff for part of it, and then the sort of top kind of sticks out over the cliff. And he was at this. He was one of the more senior lightkeepers by this point. And they had a young lad who'd just started. He was just starting his journey in the lighthouse service. So he was kind of due to do his first shift by himself that night. So as you do when you've got a new young start, all the lightkeepers were sitting around the table telling him horrendous ghost stories. And they were telling him about the grey lady who haunted the lighthouse. And they were telling them all about our terrible pale face that would appear in the night, and our scream, and our long cold fingers that would grab you while you were out in the, you know, just sitting up there by yourself on your shift. And, you know, the lad was trying to put on a brave face, but he was just, you know, clearly a bit shaken by all this. But eventually he, you know, trudges up to put the light in and to do his shift, looking a bit reluctant, and you know, they all start laughing as soon as he leaves the room. And then a couple of minutes later, he bursts back into the kitchen and he goes, I've seen the grey lady. And Ellen's thinking, right, we've maybe gone a bit far. We've clearly got him. And the young lad says, she's just as you described her. She's got this long grey face with long straggly hair, and her eyes are just staring in, and her beard. And hang on, her beard. We never said anything about a beard. But this young lad insists that this ghost is staring in the window. So eventually Alan goes up the stairs with him to see what he's on about. And well, he gets a bit of a fright himself, because sure enough, he gets up a couple of flights of the stairs and there's this eerie grey face staring in the window. And Alan's thinking, what is going on here? And then he looks a bit closer and he realises that staring in the window having jumped across to the windowsill from the cliff, is a goat. So that's a true story of the lighthouse that was haunted by a bearded lady.
Our old friend Lawrence Tulloch, Shetland storyteller, he was a lighthouse keeper as well.
He was indeed, yes. Lawrence was, it was just a really amazing experience being able to kind of meet Lawrence and spend time with him through a couple of the Orkney storytelling festivals. He was one of these, truly great storytellers that you never sort of forget once you've met him or heard him. Yeah,
I remember him telling me that it was the usual sort of thing for a young, new lighthouse keeper, was that the first thing that they would do was to take you to the shed and say, you see those boards up, planks of wood there? Yeah. Do you know what that's for? No. As your coffin if you die. Make a coffin on the site, and this was always, they always kept wood for making a coffin with. And
yes, there was the story of, how that came to be. They used to only have 2 lighthouse keepers on any lighthouse, and there was this one time the guys that were on this lighthouse together just really did not get on. Everybody knew they did not get on. And one day, one of them, he died. He just had a heart attack or something, but, he was dead. And this lighthouse keeper who's left, he thinks, if I try and do anything, if I touch this body, or if I try and I can't put him in the sea. He had no way of getting in contact with the relief, getting anybody else out. So he was so scared of being accused of murder if he did anything to touch or move the body, that he just lived with the dead body of his fellow lighthouse keeper sitting at the table for the rest of his time on the lighthouse, which, at that time could be weeks, could be months. And by the time the relief boat came to get him, he had just absolutely lost his grip on reality. He'd kind of gone completely mad with the stress of living with this body. And so the story is that from that day on, that's when they always had 3 keepers on a lighthouse, so that there was always somebody to tell the story of any goings on, and there was always wood to make a coffin just in case you needed it.
I remember hearing that story quite some time ago, but it was a different version. But I'm sure that there must be umpteen versions.
I think there are.
This couple had been, like you said, known to not like each other. And in the pub the one night, the one guy had said, I can kill you one of these days. And it was the other guy that died of natural causes. And not knowing what to do and not wanting to be accused of murdering him, he wanted to keep the body as fresh as possible so they could check it over for no sign of violence. So he wrapped them up in a bit of canvas and had the body outside on the balcony outside the lighthouse, the lantern room, the light room. And there was a gale, and this guy kind of came adrift from the shroud, the makeshift shroud, and one arm was sticking out. And when the man went up to the light room to light the light on this wild night, there was the body of his former companion, staring dead eyes through the window. And the wind was swinging him so that his hand was going tap, tap, tap against the glass. And that's what drove the guy mad.
That's absolutely horrendous. That's such a good version of that.
I mean, like I said, whether or not any of this is based on reality, I have no idea. That's the version I heard, was with the body tapping on the window.
Oh,
so, on a happier note, I remember Lawrence as well saying that he went to the one lighthouse. They all had to take it in turns cooking. And he was making macaroni cheese one night. and there was a shelf above the cooker, and he knocked the tea caddy over, and it fell into the mac and cheese. And this wasn't tea bags, this was loose leaf tea. So he got about a quarter pound of loose leaf tea in his macaroni and cheese. So he scooped out as much as he could. And then he just went, bugger it, and stirred the rest of it into the mac and cheese. And then served it up to them and told them it was herbs.
There's a lot of like cooking mishaps on lighthouses, I think, because you've got a lot of people who have probably not been doing the cooking in their houses, sort of suddenly having to cook for 3 or 4 folk at once. And there's another story of like a young lightkeeper just getting started on their journey, whose turn it was to cook, and he'd been told, right, today's meal is, mashed tatties, and he couldn't find any tatties. So what he did was he got a bag of frozen chips out of the freezer, and he boiled them and he mashed them.
Yeah, probably wouldn't be.
Not the most pleasant of
not
food experiences.
A culinary delight, indeed. I remember, again, Lawrence, and maybe you'll have to edit this, I don't know.
Dear.
I think he was in, I can't remember if it was Sumbrahead or whether it was somewhere on the north coast here. But they got a kind of a short out. Something in the electrics had gone. And this guy had gone out to check it out. And his boss was around as well, and he was saying, what was it? Have you found out what was the cause of the short? Aye, he says, horny grulligans, thousands of the bastards. And it was his word for what we would call a forky tail, an earwig. There was thousands of earwigs had been sheltering inside this fuse box and had caused it to short out. So
there is something about lighthouses and forky tailies, because I've also heard a story of Cove Sea Skerries, which is the one near Lossiemouth. And apparently they had an absolute plague of them. Like one of the keepers walked out. It was one of these ones where you have the accommodation across a courtyard from the actual light tower itself. And as you know, if you've seen the lighthouses of Scotland, they're all kept painted very bright white. That was part of the keeper's jobs. They'd have to repaint everything every so often. But they looked out in the courtyard, and the tower was just black with this wave of forky tailies. Wow. And what it turned out was happening was there was kind of a drainage space below the courtyard. And that was just the right kind of dampness and temperature for them to be breeding at an alarming rate. So they were just absolutely pouring out of the gutters. And they got into the houses, and the couple, Bob and Peggy Daggett, who told me about this, they were saying they had to plug their ears with cotton wool when they were asleep. They had to check their toothbrushes and their daughter's drinking straws before using them, because they'd be crawling up in there. And they eventually got rid of them by just pouring paraffin, because lighthouses, they kind of run on paraffin. You just pour buckets and buckets of paraffin down into the gutters, and eventually this killed enough of them off that it got back to a kind of manageable level of forky tailies.
I remember hearing a story from the Chicken Rock Lighthouse, where the principal keeper was not a terribly hygienic person and did not keep a clean lighthouse. And one of the guys tried to scrub it clean, and he was scrubbing the floors because they were absolutely filthy as well and greasy. And the only thing that he had to work with was petrol. So he started scrubbing the floors and all with petrol. And, what could possibly go wrong? So the fire that ensued was so bad that the whole inside of the lighthouse was completely destroyed, because when you think about the shape of a lighthouse, a tall round tower, it's basically just a big chimney.
Yeah.
So that's just the intense heat and drawing all that heat up and such like kind of destroyed the lighthouse.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, a verifiable thing. There was a fire on that lighthouse. And yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've heard things about Chicken Rock, but it's usually things that you get told after you've turned the tape recorder off. So to honour that, I won't share them on another recorded platform. But yes, that was a lighthouse that had a lot going on by the sounds of things.
Mm-hmm. That wasn't the one that ended up being, like, not there anymore, because they discovered that geologically it was just a pinnacle of rock that narrowed in at one point to being just extremely kind of small radius, and so they dynamited it, and the whole thing kind of came down. But it was one of them. It might not have been. Can't remember if it was Chicken Rock or another one, but it was on the west coast of Scotland, and they discovered it was just this.
So Chicken Rock, I think, is down at the Isle of Man. Yeah,
but that's still technically on the west.
It is. Not technically Scotland, but I do like the Northern Lighthouse Board just took on the Isle of Man as well. So
well, they are their own entity, basically, man. So, But anyway, I'm not sure. We'll need to look into that one and see.
But that's really interesting. Just the sort of, we'll just, instead of warning people about this rock, we'll just get rid of it. Yeah,
because it was deep enough. It wasn't going to cause a problem. It wasn't a hazard to shipping, so... Yeah, you worked for quite a while with the Lighthouse Board, as I seem to remember. Well, we're gathering the stories and such like.
Yeah, and it's something that I'm hopefully not totally finished working with as well, because when you sort of do have the privilege of putting together a collection on that scale, and my friend Martine as well has interviewed a few other people since I stopped working on it. She's interviewed people who worked in the office in George Street as well. And it is nice to find ways to kind of share these stories with the world, as well as just having them on record. And I think a lot of the people that we've both spoke to are really keen for their stories to go out there as well. One of the things that we've done recently, Martine's made a film called Lighthouse Lives, which combines audio extracts from these interviews with like archive footage and images of the lighthouses. So I'm hoping that will be released fairly soon for general viewing. We've done, Martine's been taking it on tours around various parts of Scotland, and it's always gone down really well. It's the sort of thing that I would love to go to more of these events, but as you know yourself, when you've got a job that kind of ties you to one place, you have to balance that as well. But was at one in Gairloch last summer, which was really nice. They had a bit of stories and songs, and then folk from Gairloch came and did some tunes, and combined with a showing of the film. And it's a really nice way of doing things. So hopefully that film will be on sort of general release at some point. But yes, there may be other projects in the works too. Touch wood. So watch this space.
Oh, very good, very good. In 1814, Walter Scott, before he became Sir Walter Scott, was up in Orkney as a guest of the Northern Lighthouse Board on their yacht Pharos, and they spent a bit of time here. They went to see John Ray, the Arctic explorer's dad, who was also called John Ray, because the aforementioned Arctic explorer was 11 months old at the time.
Yeah.
And but he still claimed that he remembered Scott visiting, but he did admit that it was probably just because he'd heard about it so much that he had a memory in his mind,
Images that,
But he came into Stromness, Scott, and he went up the hill here, just behind where we live, East Bray, and met Bessie Millie, the storm witch, who sold him a fair wind for sixpence. and told them the story of John Gow the pirate, who was from here, and not just the most... Well, lucky is a strange term to use when you're talking about pirates, because usually if you see a pirate ship coming here, it's not very lucky, you know. But he wasn't the most successful of pirates, shall we say. He was no Blackbeard. And but he ended up being caught and executed. But he'd plighted his troth on the Owen Stone with Helen Gordon. That's another story, but it meant that all of these characters and all of these places and the customs and all that, Scott put into a book called The Pirate, which was published in 1822. And if you want to read it, well, you're welcome to. I tried once and ended up skipping over to the good bits because it was very wordy.
Yeah.
Took a long time to go nowhere. You know?
I feel like there will come a time in my life when I will appreciate Walter Scott and kind of properly get into reading his books, but I have to admit I haven't quite got there yet. But I think he is absolutely fascinating, though, as a kind of figure in Scottish history and in Scottish literature, and in sort of how he created, you know, so much of how we understand contemporary Scotland. So I do think it would be worth me making the effort with Walter Scott.
He did certainly make up Scotland, kind of the whole cultural identity and tartans and all this sort of stuff. But the most valuable thing in the Pirate, though, really was the footnotes. They were really fascinating. His description of Bessie Millie as well, being kind of like being the same colour as the brown cloth that she wore, and the old nose and chin meeting in the middle, and the eyes that gleamed with a lustre of insanity.
Oh, right. That's it. You know? Yeah. I think that's kind of what we can all aspire to now.
Yeah. I would like to gleam with a lustre of insanity, but there you go. But then once you've, you know, just one final thing to say about Stoorworms and such like, though, is, and this might just be me randomly going off on one, I seem to remember years ago down at the waterfront gallery, there was a cassette of Orkney folk tales, and I think that might have been on it, Stoorworm. But I mean, this is quite a while ago. But then I heard somewhere that Ivan Draver was behind recordings of Orkney folk tales, maybe in the 70s or so.
That would be interesting.
So I don't know. I'll ask Ivan.
Aye, because I'm sure it was a woman's voice. I remember like doing the narration, at least for some of the stories. But you know, it might have been different narrators between the stories as well. Possibly like John Ray remembering Walter Scott. You know, I think I might be imagining things slightly different to how they actually were. So I could be proven wrong.
Just imagine if that was his wife at the time, Carolyn, who you met.
Yeah.
At the event.
That would be a bit of a Stoorworm circle, wouldn't it?
Certainly would be biting its tail, that one.
Yeah.
We'll have to find out. But then the research that you were doing into, you know, worms and that sort of thing, for your MA, then your PhD had absolutely nothing to do with
It had absolutely nothing to do with Stoorworms. And I actually feel like I might be not quite finished with the Stoorworms in some ways, because I didn't really do very much once I'd finished writing that up. I didn't really do anything with it because you just had to go and get a job and like get on with your life. And, you know, now having a bit more of an idea of how you can kind of write about things in a non-academic way, because it has to be said, academic writing is not maybe my strong point. I kind of find it quite hard to do. It doesn't come very naturally to me.
It doesn't come naturally to anybody.
Who's about to now talk about doing a PhD.
Yeah, but I mean, academic writing never really makes sense to anybody other academics, you know. I mean, it's not exactly accessible, is it?
Well, that's
or
the
interesting.
thing. And Yeah, and it possibly should be. But
absolutely,
and I think it is important to have, rigor and to have that kind of proper sort of element of research where you do have, something to make sure you're not just making it up as you go along. But with a lot of stuff, you do have to do a lot of making it up and making these leaps. When it's stuff like stories and traditions, I think you need to have a bit of space to figure out what it means. And because traditional ways of knowing things often kind of sit at odds with sort of traditionally academic ways of knowing things, it can be really hard to balance working between these two modes. And there's not really, sometimes it feels like, well, why should we try and make the traditional stuff fit into an academic box? There's ways to open up what can be considered research, I think.
Make it accessible. I mean, I am no stranger to the archaeological journals, but I mean, they are little energy vampires, you open one of those and it sucks the life out of you, So it's...
and that, it makes it quite painful to, you don't want, knowledge shouldn't necessarily be painful to acquire. I mean, sometimes it will be in life experience type ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, even I've ended up in a couple of them, but, it's a challenging read sometimes. But, I mean, sometimes the subjects covered are absolutely fascinating. And so making it accessible to the public is actually something to be applauded rather than, considered as being, it's not a case of dumbing anything down. It's just writing it in a way that people can enjoy it.
Yeah. And I think especially with the sort of topics that, we both tend to be working on, it's stuff that belongs to the people who kind of created it and passed it down. So it needs to, that's the most important people to be speaking to about it. But yeah, so after I'd done my stoorworms, I did have a few years of having a variety of what might be considered proper jobs, some of which was selling waterproof jackets, and some of which was I did a really interesting kind of apprenticeship type programme with Archaeology Scotland, doing, I think, what we would now call intangible cultural heritage, but that wasn't really a term that was about at the time. But basically I was kind of popping up going, oh, there's folklore about this, or like, we could do a story about this, whenever they found something cool. So that was a really good thing to have done. I think it gave me a really good kind of introduction to how you can work with these things within heritage. But yeah, and then I'd done the lighthouses as well. And then after working on the Lighthouse Board Oral History project, I was kind of coming to a point where I didn't know what I was doing with my life. And I was sort of sitting there going, well, the one thing I'm not going to do is go back into academia. That's not where I feel at home. That's not for me. And then I saw this advert for a funded PhD project. And it was to look into the working class poetry and song traditions of Victorian Dundee. And for a lot of people, that might be a what? But for me, that kind of rang a lot of bells with me. And so my dad's from Dundee, and that's always been a big part of my sort of life. I've always had family in Dundee, so we're visiting. And I've always been very aware that like poetry is a thing that you do, that is various members of my family, like my dad as well, would kind of make up poems, and just little rhymes to, really for no reason at all, but just because you could. So there's this stationery shop in Dundee called Burns and Harris, and literally every time we went past it on the bus, my dad would be like, Burns and Harris and Burns, they stand a hint the counter and they both take turns. That's like, but it's just, you have these wee rhymes and things that tell you about places and about, you know, things. And my great auntie Florrie as well, she was a great believer that everybody should know poetry by heart and be able to, you know, have your party piece or something that you could recite. And so I was quite aware that this was, you know, a tradition that still had echoes in the modern day. And the other important thing about it wasn't just straight up writing. It was a partnership with the Public Library in Dundee, who hold a collection of sort of local poetry in books, but also little chapbooks, pamphlets, broadsides, that sort of stuff. And part of the remit of the PhD was to do outreach and to do sort of public history with Dundee communities about this stuff. So I thought, actually, as far as jobs go, if I could, you know, if that could be my job for 3 years to research this stuff and kind of talk to folk about it, that sounds pretty good. So I decided I would apply, and I went to an interview. And I was just coming out the end of having shingles. So my brain was not in the best state. And I kind of feel like I came across as an absolute gibbering wreck, in the interview. But yeah, so I sort of left thinking, oh, well, that's all right. It's not going to be for me. But on the train home, I got a phone call from, the women who became my supervisor saying would like to offer you the studentship. So that was absolutely amazing. And I decided that I was going to move to Dundee and just get really stuck into weird old poems.
So what's the kind of poetry? I mean, was there any specific themes that seemed to be more popular than others, or was it just a wide variety?
Yeah, so the kind of framework I ended up going with for the research was looking about how people were writing about place and also like using place in their poetry to write about, but also places to perform in. So this was a time I was looking at mostly the second half of the 19th century. So you've got industrialisation, so people's relationship to place is changing really, really dramatically in a lot of ways through that. Cities are expanding and also people are kind of finding themselves having to come into the city from a rural context to make a living. And what I kind of found was that poetry seems to have been a really important way of carving out a place in the world for people and for sort of having their say about place, because a lot of the time, you know, you might read a Victorian poem about having a nice walk in the park and, you know, looking at some flowers. And to modernise, a lot of people look at that and go, well, that's really, really boring. I don't want to read somebody's, you know, nice rhyming poem about flowers. But when you think about who is writing that poem and where are they writing about, quite often they're maybe writing about a place which somebody has threatened to build a factory on or knock down or make private. And they're defending sort of really quite old rights of way and their right to be in these places. There's a hill in the middle of Dundee which is called the Law. And it's kind of your Dundonian test if you call it the Law or the Law Hill, because law means hill in Scots. So, you know, you're calling it the Hill Hill. But this was always, you know, some of the earliest settlements in the Dundee area were kind of on top of this hill, sort of fortifications. And it's been a really important place for people to just go and get out of the city. You know what we're like as humans. We flock to high places because you can get a good view over things. And this was in the 19th century, the landowner of that part of Dundee, Dudip, he decided he was going to fence it off, wall it up, turn it into a quarry. So that did not go down well. And the Dundee Right of Way Society was formed. And as well as writing poems about it, what they did was wait till it was night time, and then they would go to the lawn, they would knock down all the walls that Dundee had built each day, so he could never get past the first phase of walling it off because people would be kind of going up and just knocking it down.
Mm.
And the newspaper, the People's Journal, which we were talking about as part of the Silvery Tatus Scapa Flow show last night, they were in their early days at this point, but they ran an editorial saying, well, it's a shame that Dundee's walls keep getting knocked down, but he should really know better than to build on an extinct volcano. That must be what's doing it. And like the editor was like really involved in the Right Away Society. He's hosting their meetings and stuff. He knows exactly what's going on, but it's just that really nice way of a newspaper being sarcastic. So there's lots of examples of that sort of thing going on where a poem is totally different when you understand the context in which it's being written and the audience it's being written for. So
quite a lot of political ones as well, I would imagine.
Definitely.
But more so with cities, really.
Yeah, and there was a lot of political poetry, and I have to say, I don't think I found a single poem in favour of the Tories the whole time I was researching. There were definitely, Dundee was, well, they tended to vote Liberal, and then, Labour later on in the 20th century. It was always quite a, I think it's fair to say it has been a broadly left-wing city. I do think it's important not to kind of rest on your laurels of saying, right, we're a radical town. We've always been radical, because I think that you can get into a sense of thinking, well, if we're a radical town and we did it, it must be radical, rather than thinking, a bit more deeply about what political paths you're walking down in the present day. There's a lot of kind of interesting examples of that, even from history. There was a man, George Kinloch, who was Dundee's first MP after the Reform Bill came in. But most of his story comes from before he was elected. He became known as the Radical Laird, so he was from a kind of landowning family out in Strathmore. Sort of started his career almost as the Dundee Advertiser's farming correspondent. But when the Peterloo massacre happened in 1819, and people were killed in Manchester for demonstrating and, to get the vote, basically, he gave a speech where he accused the government of treason against its own people, which seems, absolutely fair enough. But at the time, that was quite inflammatory. He was sentenced to be transported to Australia. But because he was a laird and he had these sort of resources behind him, he managed to escape to France before they caught up with him for that. So he sort of hid out over there until things calmed down, came back to Dundee, and was elected as this kind of great hero. But he died just barely a year after he'd been elected, so he didn't really have time to make the mistakes that politicians always make, and he kind of remained this hero in Dundee history. But one of the things that, I kind of came across when I was looking into the poetry about him, and which has become more sort of talked about in the past few years since the Black Lives Matter protests, is that his family owned a plantation which was, being worked by enslaved labour. And he was the owner of that for a few years before he kind of sold it on to somebody else. And while he doesn't seem to have visited it himself, but that's part of what built up that kind of resources that allowed him to take on that role in Dundee history, basically. And he did say when he was standing for election that he was opposed to slavery in all its forms, and he wanted to make abolishing the slave trade a kind of electoral promise of his. So he clearly at least knew it was important to the electorate. But whether he kind of thought about that at the time when he was receiving royalties from this plantation,
it does seem like hypocrisy, really.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, the term radical laird just does seem like a wee bit of an oxymoron.
Yeah, it does a bit. We should probably just mention for people that aren't aware of this that the Peterloo Massacre, as it was termed, was on St. Peter's Field, wasn't it? I think it was called, in Manchester, which is now where the Free Trade Hall stands, which was the venue for the Sex Pistols playing in Manchester in 1976, with the Buzzcocks as support, first gig. Thank you, Fairy. And bands came out of that, like Joy Division, one of my favourite bands.
Do you know, I did not actually know that. That's a really good connection.
They were there that night watching the Pistols, and so they sort of got together. But anyway, inspired by that. But back to the Peterloo Massacre, it was, a protest against, a peaceful protest in favour of emancipation. So it was votes, but only for men.
Yeah.
But at that time, you had to be a big landowner before you got a vote, and they wanted votes for everyone.
That's something which I do find a bit sad as well, is that, working class women were really involved in these early protests for emancipation, and they stayed involved right the way through. But as more men got enfranchised, they seemed to drop off being less involved. So by the time you get to the suffragettes, it's mostly women doing the action.
They sent the troops in there, and with rapiers on horseback, and killed. I don't know how many people were killed in that, but I mean it was women and all as well were attacked, and seems it was like a massacre. They called it Peterloo, is a sarcastic response to Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo that had happened 4 years earlier.
Yeah, and a lot of the folk, they'd been soldiers fighting at Waterloo, and then they'd come back and their government had done this to them. So, yeah.
But it was completely unprovoked because it was a peaceful demonstration. And but yeah, so it went down in history as that. It's probably kind of forgotten about these days, really, I guess. I imagine the general public would be none the wiser about it, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that we need to remember. I think it's always important to remember that pretty much any rights that we have were not kind of benevolently given to us. They have been fought for.
Yeah, like Tolpal martyrs and all that, trying to form a union and being deported to Botany Bay. So, yeah, it's... you tend not to be given these rights, as you say, very, very rightly. Look, I'm sorry. I really, I've got to ask, Dundee, you're looking at the poetry and all that. You probably guess where I'm going with this. But who would be the most famous, probably, for maybe the wrong reasons, poet in Dundee?
Well, I think what you're maybe angling at is William McGonagall here. Yeah. And I am a big William McGonagall defender because he's actually a really interesting example of all the different types of poetic tradition that are going on at that time. So William McGonagall, I think we can give Orkney a wee bit of credit for his existence as a poet. His family was Irish, but they came to Scotland, and apparently when McGonagall was quite young, they came up to South Ronaldsay to live.
In Ireland and Orkney.
Yeah, where McGonagall received what he calls in his autobiography the only formal schooling that he ever received. And this was from a man who's like, I've been talking about him for the past 3 days and his name's just gone totally out of my head. And what was the teacher's name again?
Forbes. James Forbes.
James Forbes, of course. Sorry, James. But he was quite a well-known figure in South Ronaldsay. He was a respected teacher, but he also kept quite a wide array of animals, including eagles and a tortoise. And McGonagall had a sad encounter with this tortoise one day. He was in the schoolroom and he picked up this tortoise, and the tortoise was, just in McGonagall's hands, and possibly, a little bit stressed out at being picked up, maybe not handled too gently, but either way, the tortoise chose that moment to do a big jobby all over William McGonagall's hands, and he was not, young McGonagall was pretty put out by this and pretty disgusted, and in his shock, he dropped the tortoise. Poor creature lands on the floor, crack, and the tortoise cracked his shell and did not last long in the world after that.
Yeah, they always land shell side down when you drop them, don't they?
That's
It's like a piece of toast.
It's like the opposite of cats.
It's like about a toast, it's always going to be butter side down.
Yeah, so that was a sad. James Forbes was not too happy about that either. But
he got a bit of a flogging, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And then McGonagall's dad came up and sort of gave James Forbes a good talking to about that as well, and never hit my son again.
Got the law on him, I believe.
Yeah.
Went to see a magistrate and
it's got him to sign a thing saying he would never touch young McGonagall again. So after that, he was pretty much. He had the freedom to do what he wanted with impunity because he knew he legally could not be punished.
And Forbes was also a private tutor for John Ray, the aforementioned Arctic explorer. So him and his brothers were tutored by Forbes. Don't know about his sisters, but probably not. I mean, those days, because McGonagall's time was 1830s or so. He was in Orkney. I think he was between the ages of 8 and 11. Because Fran Flett Hollandwright, storyteller from Orkney, was doing that piece with you, a performance with yourself and Scott Gardner, the singer, and she said that he was in Orkney from the ages of 8 till 11. So I'm not going to just say that and then pretend that I knew that, because that's where I heard it from. But I didn't know that he was Ray's tutor. And the Ray boys used to go hunting for him to get rabbits and things to feed to his eagles.
You just two people you would not think of having the same teacher as William McGonagall and John Ray.
Yeah, it's an unusual link, isn't it?
Yeah, but McGonagall, sort of the family, ended up coming back to the mainland of Scotland, presumably in some element of disgrace, maybe after those goings on. But McGonagall certainly ended up kind of living in Dundee. He spent time in Edinburgh as well in his younger days, but Dundee's kind of where his creative flourishing happened.
Well, his Tay Rail Bridge Disaster poem, is kind of the one that Billy Connolly has read it on TV.
Yeah, it is. However, it's not even the worst poem written in the first week after the Tay Bridge disaster. So the important thing to know about McGonagall is that he is not kind of an outlier in terms of being a poet or a performance poet. Everyone's doing this sort of thing, especially the Tay Bridge disaster. Just for people who might not have heard about this, the Tay Bridge was built from Dundee, which is on the north side of the River Tay, across to Fife, Wormit on the other side of the Tay. So at the time it was built in the sort of late 1870s, this was an absolute, feat of engineering. It was the longest rail bridge anywhere in the world, I think. And it was uncharted territory. You know, people hadn't really done this before. So it was this kind of amazing symbol of progress to be able to cross a river that wide. And it was, you know, people kind of were really, really shocked when it came down, not just in Dundee, although, you know, Dundee was obviously hit sort of really hard by it, partly because there was a lot of people coming home to Dundee on the train. So most of the bereaved families were in Dundee. But also, you know, there's folks saw it happening because the Tay is within view of a lot of the town. So there was folk actually saw the bridge coming down in the train going into the river. And then the sort of stumps of it, you can actually still see them. So it's quite a...
It was in a storm, wasn't
haunting. It? Yeah, so it was 28th of December. Was it? Yeah. 1879, but it was that time between Christmas and New Year when everything's a wee bit weird. Nobody's in their normal kind of work patterns. Folk are gearing up for Hogmanay, and you know, it's just then they're sort of hit by this terrible disaster, and it was a storm blew the girders of the bridge down. And the train was crossing it at the time, and went into the river. So people responded to this. Like poetry was one of the main ways that people talked about things in public. So people were writing poems and sending them in to the papers. You know, they must have been like going to the newspaper office and posting poems through their door, like on the night of the disaster, because the very first issues of the newspapers where they're still kind of gathering the facts of what's happened, there's already poems appearing in the papers. And William McGonagall definitely does write a poem which has gone down in history about the disaster. There's another poem which I really do need to actually memorise, because it's one of these poems that's so weirdly bad that you can't really describe it. But it's basically a poem telling off the bridge. It's like a bad brig disrespecting your creator. And so there's one of the themes going on, like we're onto the Tay Bridge disaster, we could be here for some time. One of the themes going on in the response to that is it was a Sunday, like when the disaster happened. So should you be running trains on a Sunday? Yes. And basically everybody, you know, it's Dundee, and people were, it wasn't a very serious kind of reason considered. Nobody was really considering it as a punishment from God, apart from kind of a few voices. So this wasn't something that the papers were taking very seriously as an argument. There's almost an element of mockery when they bring up that thread of the criticism.
That's surprising, because I mean, at a time when the Sabbath breaking was considered, you know, quite a serious thing. I mean, it was just not socially acceptable. I mean, it wasn't punishable by church law anymore, but it was certainly frowned upon. So.
I wondered if this is maybe an urban-rural divide at this point in time, because I think Dundee is a very industrial city, and I think they're embracing capitalism more than they are religion, and that's not necessarily a great thing either. Because if you're just happy with folk working rather than resting, that's slightly different. But people weren't being expected to go in and work in the mills on a Sunday. You were certainly being expected to go to church and things like that. But if you got a train across the Tay to go for a nice walk somewhere, that would be considered, I think, an appropriate way to spend your Sunday in those days.
But you would still have the train drivers and the guards and all that would
absolutely.
Be working.
Like people would be, and I think that was just becoming a bit more accepted at that point. But yeah, so the sort of poetic response to the Tay Bridge disaster is quite a good way to explain what's going on with poetry in general at that time, because you've got two main genres that people are writing in, and one of them is writing sort of broadside ballads, and this is a very traditional song sort of way of composing. It's broadsides were cheap song sheets, which were just, you could be printed up really quickly and sold for, you know, a penny or half a penny. And they were a really good way of kind of learning a song if you've heard somebody sing a song and you want to get the lyrics. So once print becomes more sort of cheap and accessible, people start using these. And again, people need to be able to read as well for this to be a viable way of passing on songs. But once you've got quite widespread literacy and quite widespread access to cheap print in some regard, then these become a really popular way of passing on songs in cities in Scotland and the north of England, and probably right across England anyway. Small aside, that the main place you would get your broadsides in Dundee was a shop called the Poet's Box, which was in the Overgate, which was a kind of city centre street with a bit of a reputation by that point. Lots of pubs, lots of pawn shops, lots of quite rundown housing. So that's the kind of social context for it. But you get Poet's Box shops in Dundee and in Glasgow. These are the main places in Scotland that they really take off. But the first place you find any records of a Poet's Box shop is in Belfast. So what seems to have happened is it's a model of selling broadsides where you've got a really wee shop with a small printing press in the back room, and you can just quickly churn out songs and get them on the streets. And this seems to be something that Irish immigrants have brought over and kind of set up in Dundee and Glasgow, which were places that, you know, a lot of folk were coming over from Ireland. So interesting wee connection there. Yeah, so you've got that kind of folk song inspired way of composing songs, and there's loads of broadsides about the Tay Bridge disaster, which almost describe it like a shipwreck, you know, because we know how to write a ballad about shipwreck. And there's some of them were still, you know, folk were recording them from singers in the 1980s. So they really stayed on in the oral tradition as well. But you've also got newspaper poetry, and this is a bit more abstract, and it's a bit more wordy, because this is going to appear next to a newspaper report of what's happened. So you don't need to put all the details in like you do with a broadside. With a broadside, you're telling the story of what's happened and sort of describing how tragic it all is. But with newspaper poetry, you're sort of reflecting on events that you can assume everybody's already read about, because, you know, that's also in the paper. So they're talking a bit more about ideas and a bit more about kind of descriptions. And what William McGonagall does is he takes both of these traditions and just like mashes them together and like kind of mangles them both in the process. Because he gets in every single fact about everything that's happened, but he's also using the really long words and kind of flowery lines that you would expect in a newspaper poem. So that's like, he could only exist in that time and place with these traditions coming into his head. It
was always kind of famous with him that his last line was about as long as the previous two or three or whatever, you know. It would just sort of like go on and on. Could we have a quick break, because I must pee? Yeah. So should we start with a Muir recording? Okay, right. I was just going to say, do you want to talk about storytelling? But
I suppose we could talk about storytelling.
Okay. So you end up, you've done all this, the work with the Dundee poets, Victorian poets, but you're still telling stories. I mean, you are a storyteller.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder. sometimes am I a storyteller? But I suppose I do tell stories quite a lot. So
well, you're in the directory of Scottish storytellers. So I mean, I think it's a fair assumption to make that you are.
It took me a while to get there for various reasons.
It wasn't for lack of talent. It was just,
I think one of the things to bear in mind with storytelling as well is you can often feel today there's such a pressure to almost achieve everything when you're still quite young and to be kind of putting your name out there and getting attention on social media and everything. But storytelling and traditional arts in general, I think, are still a place where it's really rewarding to actually take things a bit more slowly and not be in too much of a hurry to be at the top of your game while you're still young.
But my old pal, the late Professor Boo Armquist, when he met Lawrence Tulloch in Shetland, he says, "And what age were you when you started to tell stories?" Boo was Swedish. This is my Swedish accent. Where's my Boo impression? "And what age were you when you started to tell stories?" And Lawrence says, "I was 14. He goes, "That is a good age to start," he said. So he kind of felt that you needed that world experience. But I mean, but many of us, of course, like me as well, started telling stories long before I hit 40. But,
I think you can start, and it's great to start when you're young, but also just not be in a hurry to hit any kind of peak or goal or say, right, this is where I need to be by this age.
It's not a competition, and I think that if you have that mindset, then you're going to be, in my opinion, a bit lacking as a storyteller, because it's all about me and not all about the story, which is what it should be about, in my humble opinion.
Yes. So I think storytelling is one of those kind of art forms that rewards taking it a bit slowly. And I suppose it did take me a wee while to, I knew maybe quite early in my life that I was really interested in storytelling and in telling stories, but it took a while to figure out where I was going to be doing that from, like what's my grounding, what's the tradition that I'm coming from. Because I think when I started out, I felt like I didn't come from a tradition at all. Because if you don't grow up thinking about your culture as a tradition, you just maybe, you don't recognize that. But then, with time, you sort of realize maybe my tradition is like strange people reciting weird poems on a street corner in Dundee. And that's fine. I can work with that. But yeah, I mentioned that I've got family connections to Dundee, so I heard quite a lot of just wee anecdotes mostly from that part of the world. Wee sort of stories about maybe a haunted mill or just, something funny that happened. My mum's family's from Tannadice in rural Angus, so I also, my mum's sister, my Auntie Fiona, was quite into, she was very into stories and things as well. And so I heard traditions from that part of the world. And even if it's not a huge amount of stories, maybe it's just like, a wee handful of things about different places, but they always sort of really stuck in my head. So I started thinking maybe this is kind of where I'm coming from a tradition, and it's, I've always lived in cities, so how we kind of live with tradition in a city context is something that I think is quite important as well. And yeah, that's, I started sort of thinking about how do I maybe learn more stories from the sort of Dundee and Angus part of the world, and see if that kind of feels like the right place for me to be. And then I did that for a few years.
Then it landed in your lap, didn't it?
Well, yeah. So I think what you're angling at is the fact that I wrote the Angus Folktales book for the History Press Folktales series. And that so I decided to pitch that after a few years of trying to get to know the stories from that part of the world and starting to tell some of them a bit more. And, you know, I remember it was quite early in my storytelling journey that series had started coming out. I remember I had Bob Pegg's Highland folk tales, and then, you know, your Orkney folk tales, Lawrence's Shetland folk tales, and the Fife folk tales by Sheila Kinnanmonth and Perthshire folk tales by Lindsay Gibb, who we had as a guest at the Orkney Storytelling Festival last year. They were kind of, you know, these were volumes that I was sort of reading and thinking, oh, this is brilliant. Who's going to do Angus? When's Angus going to come out? When's Angus going to come out? And it had been like about a decade of this series existing and me kind of reading these books and waiting for somebody to write the Angus one. And nobody was doing it. And then I started thinking, well, maybe I actually have, you know, I've kind of got together enough stories now that this could be an Angus folk tales. And then I thought about it for another like year or so. And then after a while, I was just like, right, I'm going to email Donald Smith and see what he thinks. You know, would you, because Donald Smith is somebody whose opinion that I trust as a storyteller. Yeah. So I emailed him just saying, Donald, I've been thinking about pitching this volume to the History Press. What would you recommend? And then like 5 minutes later, he's just emailed somebody at the History Press and gone, here's your Angus person. So that, you know, obviously without Donald's kind of support, I think a lot of us in Scottish storytelling wouldn't be where we are.
He is amazing, and I hope we can nab him for one of these interviews at some stage as well. He's got quite a story to tell as well, but
he does.
He always refers to himself to me as Granny. Granny Ken's best, he always said. So I'd go into the Storytelling Centre and say, "It's me Granny Donald in," and they'd go, "Huh?"
I think because Donald's been so devoted to supporting and organising other storytellers for the past, you know, a long time now, then we don't get to hear as much from him as we should. So I think if you can nab him for one of these, that would be amazing to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. But I remember him speaking about this at the time, actually, and he was saying that, you know, we've got Erin for Angus folk tales, and I mean, nobody better, he said, you know.
Aww.
So it's, yep, he was very much on side.
That's really lovely to hear, actually. But yeah, so I got the contract through for that the same week we went into lockdown in 2020. So what I had thought might be a fun year of wandering about, you know, going to all these places, and, you know, writing the stories in the places they're about was kind of, you know, wasn't allowed to leave the city boundaries for most of that year.
Give you a chance to write, though.
Yeah, absolutely did. It absolutely did. So I was still working from home throughout lockdown, but then all of the other stuff that you usually do wasn't really happening. So it was an interesting time to just really kind of wander about the house and go on my little government mandated walk, kind of going over stories in my head, and just sort of, one of the really enjoyable but also challenging things about putting together a book like that was some stories, you know, I'd found them in a sort of quite a kind of 19th century antiquarian type format, shall we say. And I'm really, really fascinated by and grateful to the 19th century antiquarians who were going and writing down all this stuff that was going on in their local places. But sometimes you get a version of a story which doesn't, you know, doesn't feel right to me because of the perspective that it's putting on the people that it's talking about. You know, there are some versions of stories where like they're talking about traveller people in the stories as kind of this, you know, exoticized, strange type of people, and that, you know, didn't sit right. So it was really, really interesting to kind of sit with these stories and think about how is this actually, what's the core of this story, rather than some of the attitudes that have come down, because there's it's interesting as well. I don't know if you find sometimes you'll find a story in an older source and there's maybe like one or two written versions of it, and you sort of go, you know, do you ever sometimes get a feeling like this is definitely a folktale versus this might not really be a folktale, just based on purely there's something about the story, and you just go, you couldn't have just made that up.
Now, some of it you can kind of tell has been embroidered or has been sort of worked up a bit, you know. But then you find the ones that it's just got that real kind of kernel of honesty and truth about it, that you think, nah, this is where it all came from, you know. Other bits is the sort of frippery attached, but this is the core of the story.
So the process of, you know, working out what the core of the story was and then what my version of it was going to be from some of the stories that hadn't really been told much in the intervening years was a really interesting process. And I do quite enjoy thinking about how our brains, you know, work with stories and how narrative kind of lives in our heads. So it's quite fun from that perspective. And then it's just absolutely, I still haven't really got used to the fact that, you know, people will actually read it. And
well, I read it.
Maybe even tell a story from it. And that's just, I think, the absolute kind of dream of anyone who works within storytelling, is that, you know, you feel like you've done a little bit to keep the tradition going and to maybe encourage somebody else to tell stories and to just be part of this network of people across years and places that keep these things going on. So that's I think that's the only thing I really aspire to as a storyteller.
Well, it's a good thing to aspire to. Because, I mean, sometimes you get with some storytellers, it's all about me, you know. I mean, not all of them. I hasten to add. But there are the odd one that's around the world that kind of, you know, it's all about them as a performance. And you can go along and admire them, you know. And it's like, nah, it's about the stories. It's got sod all to do with you. Obviously, if you're a bad storyteller, I mean, if you're somebody that just can't tell a story, you know, and you're sort of going, you know, into great long-winded detail about something that's completely trivial, you know, because you've just got no idea of how to construct the story, then, you know, that's one thing. But yeah, you get people that just kind of look at me. No, never mind about the story. It's all about me. I can't be doing with that at all, as you've probably noticed over the years. I may have mentioned it.
It's interesting. I mean, there is definitely a place for bigger sort of performance type storytelling, because it can be, you know, some of these stories are big epic things that need that oomph behind them.
Oh yeah. But it's just that this, like, everything is just, it's about the stories are relevant, you know. Yeah. And it should never be. But I mean, when you were gathering together all that stories for this, for the Angus folktale book, which I would thoroughly recommend to anybody who wants to really just sit down and get a good read, was there any story in particular that really kind of that you just love, that you just? I mean, it's difficult because you say, what's your favourite? And it's like, where do you start, you know? But is there any that just is in your heart that you go, that's mine?
Well, there's loads. So the one that I knew was in my heart when I started writing it is Jockey Barefoot, which is a story that I know you will have heard me telling at the Orkney Festival over the years. And it is one of my favourites. It's one that I heard from my mum's family, and it's a tragic tale of an evil landlord.
Would you like to tell?
I'm just going to mention another story as well, which I didn't know I was going to absolutely love when I started writing the book, because it's one of those ones that took me a while to get into my sort of ahead, if you see what I mean. But since doing it, it has absolutely like taken hold of me as well. And that's the Twins of Edzell, which is the story that Catherine Suter chose to illustrate for the cover. And that's a tragic tale of an evil landlord. We have a theme in Angus.
Yeah.
But it's an amazing story about two deaf twins from a traveller family and their sort of uneasy relationship with the community around them. And with the nature and the landscape of where they live as well. And the thing about that story is it's probably the one that's gone out most into the world as well. And one of the things that, like I was just saying a minute ago about, we just want things to kind of pass on to people and to the people who are ready to hear them. There was a deaf storyteller made an amazing film based on that story of her telling it as well. Her name was Tanya, and I'm having a bit of a brain blank on her surname, unfortunately, but I'll look that up and make sure you get it in the show notes, because that was just for the story of the deaf twins to be going back into the deaf community and be told in their own language. Just felt really, really important. So I'm very glad that it found its way out in that way. So.
Yeah, great stuff. I was just looking at Rhonda again. We do notes, do we? Oh, we do. Oh, bloody hell! There you go. So anyway, would you like to tell the story of Jockey Barefoot?
Yeah. Okay.
We can kind of close on that. I think because it's a great story.
So this is a story from Finhaven in Angus. And at one time, the Laird of Finhaven Castle, he was one of the Lindsay family, who were well-known landowners in that part of the world, but everyone knew him as Errol Beardy, because he had this wee sort of devil-looking like beard. The other thing that they called him was the Tiger Errol, because he had an absolutely horrendous temper. He was very quick to anger, and there was not much that brought Errol Beardy any joy in this world. There was two things that he loved. One of them was gambling. He loved a game of cards, and the higher the stakes, the better. And the other thing that he loved was the chestnut tree that grew in the grounds of Finhaven Castle. This was a beautiful big Spanish chestnut tree which grew from an acorn that folk said had been dropped centuries before by a Roman soldier. But Errol Beardy used to just wander the grounds and gaze at this tree, and he would stand with his hand on the trunk admiring it. And well, those were Errol Beardy's two joys in the world. And also living in the lands around Finhaven at this time was a wee boy called Jockey. Now, Jockey was an orphan. He didn't have a family, he didn't have a home, so he made a living carrying messages between the farms, and he would get a bite to eat or a barn to sleep in as his wages. And Jockey never had enough money to get together to buy a pair of shoes, so he was always walking in his bare feet, and folk called him Jockey Barefoot. Now, one day Jockey had just finished dropping off a message at one of the farms, and he was wandering off to his next appointment when along came a man riding a big black horse, a beautiful shiny creature, and the man was dressed in a dark cloak, and Jockey didn't recognise him. He looked finer than most of the folk they saw in these parts. But he stopped Jockey and he said, "Oi, are you the messenger boy around these parts?" And Jockey looked up at him and he says, "Aye, sir, that's me." And the man reached into his pocket and he pulled out a white envelope. It had a red wax seal on it. Now, Jockey was used to getting scraps of paper or even just, a verbal message to pass on. He wasn't used to seeing anything this grand. And the stranger says, "You take this to Errolbeardie at Finhaven Castle. It's important. You must see that it is delivered." And he reached into his pocket again. He pulled out a gold coin and handed that down to Jockey. Now, Jockey had never seen this much money in his life, never mind had it for himself. So he clutched that coin and he put it in his pocket and he bowed to the stranger and he said, "Aye, sir, I'll do that right away." And away he ran towards the castle. Now, when Jockey got to the gates of Finhaven Castle, he went round to the servants' entrance at the back and he rang the bell. There was no answer. So he thought he didn't want to leave without seeing the letter go into somebody's hands. So he decided he would try clambering up over the wall, and he did that. He got to the top of the wall and he loped down the other side, but, well, he landed on his ankle and he twisted it. And he tried to get up, but Jockey found he could barely walk. And he sort of crawled across the grounds for a bit and he thought, well, I'll need something to stand up on. And he saw there was this big chestnut tree with its branches spreading almost down to the ground. So he crawled over to that and he reached up and he broke a bit of a branch off that would fit under his oxstar that he could use as a bit of a walking stick. And with that, he hurpled over to the back door of the castle. And when Jockey knocked on the door, it was Errolbeardie's butler that answered it. Jockey took the letter out of his pocket and he held it out and he said, You must give this to the Earl, sir. I've to see that it's delivered today." And the butler took the letter out of his hand and he was about to shut the door in Jockey's face. And that might have been the end of things, but the Earl was wandering through his corridors at the time and he saw wee Jockey framed in the doorway there with a stick under his arm. So he barreled down the corridor and he shoved his butler out of the way and he says, "You, boy, where did you get that stick?" And Jockey's looking up at him and the Earl's face is going purple with rage and Jockey's terrified. He's just a wee lad and he says, I'm sorry, sir. I had to come over the wall to get in and I hurt my ankle, so I took a branch from your tree." And the Earl grabbed Jockey's arm and he said, "So, you've trespassed on my property and you've damaged my chestnut tree. That is a serious offence, boy." And he says to the butler, "Go and fetch a length of rope, for there's going to be a hanging." Now, when the rest of the servants in the castle heard about this, they knew Jockey, they knew he was harmless, and they tried to plead with the Earl to see a bit of mercy just this once, but he was hearing none of it. So Errolbeardie, he saw that wee Jockey Barefoot was hanged from the branches of that same chestnut tree. And because there was no family to give the poor lad a proper burial, he had his body taken up onto the hills and burnt. And it was just after the Earl had done this and he was feeling good about seeing justice done that he decided he was going to open that letter. And it was an invitation to a grand ball at Glam's Castle in a week's time. Now, the Earl was absolutely delighted by this. Glam's Castle was where all the great and the good of the local area would be, and there would be plenty of folk to show off in front of, and there would be drink, and he was sure that there would be a wee game of cards or two as well. So when the time came for that evening, the Earl made his way to the castle, and as he was arriving, he saw all the horses there lined up in the stables, and he recognised most of them. But there was one beautiful, shiny, black horse that he didn't recognise, and he admired this horse. And that was in the Earl's mind as he went through the evening chatting and drinking, and eventually, one by one, everyone staggered off to their homes or to their beds in the castle, and there was only two left at the end of the night. And there was Errolbeardie, and there was a strange man that the Earl hadn't spoken to yet. And this man was dressed in black, and the Earl said, I've seen that black horse outside. Is that your horse, man? And the stranger said, It is indeed. It is indeed. And Earl Beardy said, Well, where did you get a horse like that? I've never seen one like that in my life before. The stranger said, Well, I can't tell you that, but tell you what. I hear you're a bit of a gambling man, so we'll have a wee game of cards, and if you win, she's yours. And the Earl said, Well, that sounds like a good prize indeed, but what would you ask from me if you were the winner? And the stranger says, Well, I like to keep things interesting, so I won't tell you your forfeit until we know the outcome of the game. Now, this is the point where a sober man or a sensible man would say, No, you're all right, pal, and make for his bed. But Earl Beardy was neither of those things. And so the stranger took up a bottle of whiskey, and the two of them went to a wee room where they knew they would not be disturbed, and they started dealing out the cards. Now, Earl Beardy was usually quite good at the gambling, but that night he had the worst luck he'd ever had in his life. He lost hand after hand, and he knew that he would not be the winner that night. And when he looked to the stranger to ask what his forfeit was going to be, he looked down below the table and he saw the cloven feet, and he looked into the eyes of the devil himself. And that has been Earl Beardy's forfeit since then. He sits in that room in Glam's Castle, playing hand after hand of cards with the devil, and always losing. And you know that they must still be in there, because when you go and count the rooms on the outside of Glam's Castle, you'll always see one more window than you can count when you go round from the inside. And then poor wee Jockey Barefoot as well. There's you know, the bothy lads from round about that part of Angus are pretty tough. They're hard to flag, but some of them did say that when they were walking back home across the hills near Finhaven, there would be a wee boy sometimes walking into step with them with no shoes on, and he would never say very much. But if you were with him walking when you came to the Lemno Burn, he would just burst into flames and disappear.
Oh.
That's
that's a tragic tale. Glam's Castle was where the Queen Mother was born, Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother, as well.
So. There's a lot of really sad and spooky things going on in Glam's Castle.
They have a monster in the attic and all that as well.
Yeah, I mean that is
another story.
I won't start on that because we could be here. We could be here all night if I get started on Glam's Castle in general.
Well, it's been an absolute delight speaking to you today, Erin, and you've been a very dear friend for a while, and I hope that continues for a lot of years more. So Erin Farley, storyteller, archivist, doctor, Erin Farley, I should say, PhD. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tom and Rhonda. It's been really enjoyable just having a chat about all these things.
Aye, always a pleasure.
Cheers.
Thank you.